You wake up in the mud. You're not sure if it's your bed or just a particularly ambitious puddle. Either way, it's cold. It smells vaguely like sheep, and something squishy just crawled into your boot. Welcome to the early medieval construction site. You're not here to relax. You're not even here to survive comfortably. You're here to build a castle. With your hands. And a lot of rocks. Mostly rocks. There are no cranes, no forklifts, no laser levels. Just ropes, timber, sore muscles, and your slowly fading will to live. The year is somewhere between 1066 and 1350. But honestly, you're too illiterate and sleep-deprived to care. You're a peasant, or maybe a serf if you're lucky. You don't own land. You barely own your own teeth. But what you do own is a daily, unpaid internship in the fine art of medieval masonry. You sit up slowly, trying to remember how many vertebrae you started with yesterday. It feels like fewer now. Before we go any further, take a second to do something revolutionary. Like the video and subscribe to this channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, don't fake it. This is a no-pressure, low-sleep zone. And while you're here, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always bizarrely comforting to see people from Tokyo to Toronto all using medieval misery to fall asleep. Now, let's get back to the 13th century mud pile you call home. Your castle-building journey doesn't start with a blueprint. It starts with a mun yelling at you. Probably someone named Hugh. Or Richard. There were only like 6 acceptable names in medieval England, and none of them were subtle. The mun yelling is your lord's master mason, a grumpy wizard of stone and splinters who smells like lard and divine right. He's got a plan. Or more accurately, he's got a stick, and he's drawing lines in the dirt while muttering to himself in Norman French, which you don't speak. You nod anyway, because saying no gets you fed to the pigs. Metaphorically. Mostly. The first thing you learn is that building a castle starts with digging. A lot of digging. Trench digging. Foundation digging. Moat digging. Digging so much that your dreams involve shovels begging you for mercy. The ground isn't soft either. It's clay, stone, or if you're really unlucky, chalk. You dig with wooden tools and iron picks, so blunt they feel like medieval stress toys. There are no gloves. Just calluses and prayers. And then there's the hauling. You, a sack of bones and a potato sack shirt, are somehow expected to carry giant stones from the quarry several miles away. And by carry, I mean wobble them onto a cart and hope the donkey doesn't have a breakdown halfway through. Spoiler alert, the donkey will have a breakdown halfway through. That's why there's an entire replacement donkey, standing by with a look of pure existential dread. Let's talk about the stones. They're not pre-cut. They're not even helpful shapes. They're just giant lumps of limestone, sandstone, or flint that you have to shape with a hammer and a deep hatred of geology. The mason will show you how to cut it once. Maybe. Then you're on your own, making vaguely rectangular rocks for 10 hours a day while your fingers slowly fuse into stone themselves. And don't even think about complaining. You're being paid. In food. Sometimes. Usually barley bread so dense it could be used as a siege weapon. Maybe some ale, thin as dishwater. Your lunch break is 15 minutes of chewing something that may or may not contain twigs. Once the foundation is laid, assuming you've not been buried alive in it, which was apparently a minor occupational hazard, the walls go up. Slowly. Painfully. Without scaffolding as you know it. No, you use wooden scaffolds made by the same guy who built your cousin's coffin last winter. Which is comforting. The planks creak under your weight. They're held together by rope, faith, and possibly dried goat intestines. Every time you climb one, you say a little prayer. Not to God, but to gravity, begging it for mercy. You're using a pulley system, which sounds fancy until you realize it's just a glorified rope and wheel. Sometimes there's a human-powered treadmill crane, yes, like a hamster wheel for full-grown men. If you're lucky, you don't get picked to operate it. If you're not lucky, enjoy walking in place for 14 hours while hoisting a quarter-ton block 20 feet into the air. No, OSHA does not exist yet. And let's talk about the weather. It's either raining, about to rain, or just finished raining. Medieval England has 2 seasons, wet and slightly wetter. Your clothes never dry. Your skin never stops chafing. And your boots, if you have them, are made of leather so raw it might still moo. You are always, always damp. And not in the romantic Victorian Miss kind of way, more like a mildew-ridden sock that's developed sentience. By now, you've made it maybe 2 meters up the wall. Only 30 more to go. And let's not forget the lime mortar. That magical goo that holds the whole place together. Making lime mortar involves burning limestone in a kiln until it basically has a nervous breakdown and becomes quicklime. Then you mix it with water, which causes it to hiss, spit, and sometimes explode. If you get it on your skin, it'll happily melt your arm off. If you breathe in the dust, your lungs file for divorce. So of course, you're tasked with hauling barrels of it up ladders. And while all this is happening, the master mason is carefully measuring everything with tools made out of sticks and string, and somehow still getting better results than your last IKEA shelf. He's carving little marks into the stones, telling you which way they go. Not that you can read them. They're basically medieval emojis. One means this side up, another means fix it or die. You assume. But progress happens. Slowly. Over years. A wall here. A tower there. A gatehouse that takes 7 summers and most of your hairline to complete. And let's be clear, this is your entire life now. People don't finish castles in your lifetime. They die while castles are still happening around them. Your children might get to build the top floor. If they don't die of plague or get conscripted into a war over who owns the next hill. And speaking of war, because why not add existential dread to back pain? The entire reason for this castle is to defend against people exactly like you, but slightly angrier and better armed. So while you're breaking your back to build this thing, just remember, if it ever works properly, you'll be stuck outside it. And still doing the digging. Let's take a moment here to acknowledge the smell. Because history is not scratch and sniff for a reason. The castle site reeks of sweat, wet wool, animal dung, bad breath, and the occasional dead rat no one has the energy to remove. Your nose gets used to it, eventually. Sort of like Stockholm Syndrome, but with odor. Even the water is suspect. If you're drinking from a stream, congratulations, you now have dysentery. If you're lucky enough to have a well nearby, you'll be fighting the rats and other peasants for it. Boiling water is a luxury reserved for people who can afford firewood, which is not you. You are cold. Always cold. Except when you're too hot, in which case you're sunburnt and your tunic now resembles a very sad dishcloth. But let's say you persevere. Let's say you keep building. One stone at a time. One wall at a time. You help raise a tower so tall it scrapes the sky, or at least feels like it after a week of climbing stairs made of uneven limestone blocks. The walls thicken to 3 meters across. The arrow slits are carved by hand, each one a portal through which murder will someday occur. Joy. You help build a keep, the great big stone box in the center. The last refuge when everything outside the walls turns into a flaming medieval piñata. The keep is made of impossibly thick walls, narrow doorways, and staircases designed to make invaders trip and fall, while everyone inside throws boiling oil on them. It is not cozy. It is not welcoming. It is function over comfort. And that function is surviving the worst Tuesday of your life. And yet, there's something strangely satisfying about it. You step back, wipe the mud from your eyes, and stare up at what you've made. A stone giant looming over the countryside. Imperfect, crumbling in spots, but real, strong. The kind of structure that outlives kings, plagues, and at least 3 dynasties. You built that. With nothing but rope, sweat, and spite. And that's just the first level. But you're not done. Oh no. The Lord has decided he needs a curtain wall, and a barbican, and a drawbridge, and maybe a private chapel where he can pretend to be humble. So you go back to the quarry. You go back to the scaffolding. You go back to your muddy little tent and your barley mush. Because castles don't build themselves. And cranes? Those are for the rich Venetians and the far future. Here, in your soggy medieval corner of the world, the only thing lifting stones is you. Now roll over. Close your eyes. You've got more stones to cut tomorrow. And probably the rest of your life. You wake up to someone throwing cold water in your face. At first, you think it's rain. But no. It's deliberate. It's Jeff. Jeff thinks it's funny. Jeff also smells like raw onions and chronic disappointment. And unfortunately, you're going to be stuck building the north curtain wall with him for the next 6 months. You drag yourself out of your straw bed, which crackles beneath you in a way that suggests mice have been redecorating. Your joints ache. Your back sounds like a sack of dry twigs every time you move. The air is misty. Again. Because this is England. Or France. Or possibly Wales. Honestly, the fog is so thick you've forgotten which side of the border you're on. Today, you're continuing work on the outer wall, the one designed to keep peasants like you out, ironically. You're inside for now. But don't get too cozy. The second the Lord doesn't need you anymore, you'll be back outside the gate with the rest of the mud-stained commoners begging for barley and relevance. The curtain wall is basically a giant stone security blanket, usually between 20 and 30 feet tall and so thick you could live inside it, which, fun fact, some people eventually did. But we'll get there. You, however, are not building cozy stone condos. You are building defensibility, which is a long medieval word that means this will hurt someone later. Before anything goes up, it has to go down. That's right, more digging. Because the foundation of a good wall isn't magic. It's rock. Crushed rock. Packed into a trench so deep you start to question your life choices with every shovelful. You don't even get a shovel half the time. You get a sharp stick. Or a flattened spade shaped like a paddle and approximately as useful. And yes, you're still doing all this without cranes. Let's talk about that again. Because at no point does a mystical crane appear and say, "Hey, let me help with that 1-ton chunk of granite you're balancing on your spleen." No. You get a lever, a rope, maybe a wooden winch. Or you build a ramp. Out of dirt. Which you haul up. With more dirt. It's like medieval CrossFit, except you never get abs. Just a hunchback and some deeply repressed trauma. Now, the stones you're working with today are heavy enough to make you question the laws of physics. But they need to fit together, tightly. Because if they don't, the wall wobbles. If the wall wobbles, the Lord wobbles. If the Lord wobbles, you get executed for sabotage, which is French for you messed up and now you die. So you're learning the glorious, repetitive art of dry stone fitting. No mortar, at least not for the first layer. You take irregular stones and chip them into shapes that don't fight with each other. Think medieval Jenga, but the blocks weigh 200 pounds and your life is on the line. Literally. You drop one of these, and it's goodbye toes. Goodbye foot. Goodbye Jeff. Not that anyone will miss Jeff. The master mason checks your work occasionally by hitting it with a mallet and glaring at it like it owes him money. If it doesn't fall apart, you're fine. If it does, congratulations, you've invented a new form of medieval sculpture, failure in limestone. Once the dry layers are in place, mortar is slathered between the stones. Not delicately, not with finesse, but in a fashion best described as desperate enthusiasm. Lime mortar again, still caustic, still enthusiastic about ruining your lungs. Some poor soul, possibly you, is stirring it in a barrel with a wooden paddle, trying not to splash it on your face. Your gloves? Still non-existent. Your protection? The skin God gave you, and the hope it holds out a few more weeks. You're also tasked with carting buckets of gravel, sand, and broken stone to fill in the gaps. Because medieval walls aren't just stone shells, they're thick, layered sandwiches of rubble and mortar. The outside is dressed stone, the inside is everything else. Kind of like a really hostile lasagna. You spend your morning passing bucket after bucket up the ramp. The ramp is slick with mud and goat poop. You slip. Twice. The third time you just sit down for a minute and consider switching careers. Like plagueman. Or highway bandit. Something less physically taxing. But the wall gets taller. And now it needs features. Arrow slits. Crenellations. Walkways. Jeff gets excited about the word crenellation. You do not. Arrow slits are narrow vertical openings that archers use to shoot at people while remaining mostly unshootable themselves. They're shaped like a keyhole and carved into thick stone. You help shape them with chisels that make your arms vibrate for hours after. Your hearing is also slowly disappearing, but it's not like you had many pleasant things to listen to. Mostly coughing. And Jeff. The walkway, technically called the wall walk, is a path along the top, wide enough for a couple of soldiers to jog back and forth while panicking. You build this out of timber laid into recesses in the wall. And by you, I mean you and 6 other grunting, barefoot construction slaves trying not to drop the planks. Let's pause and look around, shall we? To your left, a mason is carving a decorative corbel that looks like a demon eating a fish. To your right, Someone is mixing more mortar with the kind of enthusiasm normally reserved for chasing rats. Behind you, a wheelbarrow has tipped over and is now being kicked by Jeff, who blames evil spirits for his clumsiness. And somewhere above, the Lord is watching from a temporary wooden gallery, sipping watered-down wine and pretending to understand architecture. Eventually, someone, probably not you, starts fitting in the murder holes. These are actual openings in the ceiling of a gatehouse that allow defenders to pour boiling oil, rocks, or other medieval mood enhancers onto invaders below. You install these with care, knowing full well that if the wall ever fails, you'll be on the receiving end. Speaking of fails, let's discuss collapse. Because without modern engineering, medieval walls collapsed. Often. Sometimes during construction. Sometimes during use. Sometimes just because God was in a bad mood. If the foundation shifted, if the mortar was wrong, if someone got lazy with the fitting, boom. The whole side could slump like a drunk giant. And yes, it happened while people were on it. You learn not to get attached. By week 6, you're sleeping in a semi-permanent lean-to made of scrap wood and thatch. It leaks. Everything leaks. Even your face. But the work continues. The wall inches higher, and now you're adding a parapet, that raised stone edge that gives soldiers just enough cover to yell insults without getting decapitated. The parapet includes mullions and embrasures. Mullions are the solid parts. Embrasures are the gaps. Together, they form the familiar teeth look of a castle wall. You will never look at those the same again. Not after carving 48 of them by hand, with blisters and resentment as your only companions. The master mason occasionally comes by to test your knowledge. What is the purpose of this slope, he asks. Rain runoff, you mutter, because you were paying attention that one time. And why is this wall slightly thicker at the base? So it doesn't fall over, you reply, smiling grimly. He grunts approval. You feel like you've earned a PhD in being yelled at by rocks. The next phase is the battlement, where the fun part of the castle goes. You install hoardings. These are wooden extensions that jut out from the wall, letting defenders rain death vertically down the side. They are built hastily. They creak in the wind. You wouldn't trust them to support a cat. But they make the castle look fearsome, which is the point. There's also the gatehouse. A huge, overly complicated architectural flex with portcullises, yes, plural, redundancy was in style, guard rooms, and a drawbridge. The drawbridge is a miracle of timber engineering. You help with the chains, which are iron, heavy, and bite your hands like angry snakes. There's also a counterweight mechanism that nobody understands fully but everyone pretends to. If you're smart, you've learned to work near the blacksmith. The blacksmith has heat. The blacksmith has tools. The blacksmith has zero patience but does occasionally share hard biscuits. You pass him rivets and watch him forge hinges so massive they could double as murder weapons. By the time winter hits, the wall is nearly complete. Your beard has grown in strange patches. Your teeth are stained from cheap wine and cheaper stew. Your legs ache constantly. Your dreams are just loops of you moving stones from one pile to another. But the wall stands. Against the wind. Against the rain. Against everything. Until the Lord decides he wants it 10 feet taller. Of course. So you start over. Not completely. But emotionally? Absolutely. And one final note before you collapse into your straw again. The wall you just built? It's not just a defense. It's a message. To rivals. To peasants. To history. It says, I own this land. I can afford to pile up thousands of stones in one place for no reason other than vanity and fear. And you, builder of walls, you did not build this for yourself. You built it for someone who will never know your name. But you know what? That wall is still standing. And Jeff? Jeff got kicked by a mule last week and now thinks he's a turnip. So at least there's that. Close your eyes. Tomorrow we build a tower. You wake up to the sound of Jeff singing again. It's not a song you recognize. Probably because it's just him making what vowel sounds between mouthfuls of raw onion. You think about ending him with a trowel, but you don't want to be burned for heresy. Again. Today's assignment? Lifting a 3-ton stone 40 feet in the air using nothing but medieval vibes and poor decisions. You were hoping for something relaxing. Maybe digging a latrine. Maybe patching the Lord's chicken coop. But no. Apparently, it's time to raise the castle's tower. You know, the dramatic centerpiece that says, this person has a disturbing amount of power and possibly a small army of archers with unresolved trauma. The tower, sometimes called the keep or dungeon, which is French for house with trust issues, is the tall, central structure of a castle. It's where the Lord hides during sieges, where important guests are locked up, and where you'll probably die when it eventually collapses because you accidentally set the scaffolding on fire. Not again. But let's focus on today. Today, you are lifting. So, before we continue, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps me keep making these long, weird, fact-drenched sleep stories. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Always fun to see who's building castles with us in the middle of the night. Now, back to your doom. Your main tool for lifting several tons of stone without a crane is something that sounds fake but is very real, the tread wheel. Imagine a hamster wheel. Now make it 10 feet tall. Now shove a grown man inside it and have him walk in circles like he's trying to power a time machine made of pain. That's the tread wheel. A giant wooden wheel attached to a pulley system. You walk. The wheel turns. The rope pulls. The stone rises. In theory. In practice, it's a death trap. You've seen it go wrong. A rope snaps, a wheel misaligns, and suddenly a beautiful block of limestone is accelerating toward the earth at speeds that violate Newtonian physics, which haven't even been invented yet. Jeff claims he once saw a moon catapulted 30 feet into a pigsty. The pigs were never the same. Today, it's your turn in the wheel. You climb in slowly. The boards creak. The wood smells like sweat, mold, and centuries of bad decisions. You start walking. The wheel lurches. Your entire body braces like it's preparing for a divine reckoning. You keep walking. The wheel creaks. The rope groans. The stone, several hundred pounds of quarried misery, begins its ascent. You're basically the medieval version of a forklift. A sad, damp, wheezing forklift with back problems and no union. Outside the wheel, your coworkers guide the block with ropes called taglines. These keep the load from spinning like a demonic disco ball. You hear shouting. You keep walking. Your calves are on fire. You start reciting a psalm, not for religious reasons, but because it gives you something to focus on other than the fact that your spine is now shaped like a question mark. Eventually, the stone reaches the platform. Someone shouts hold, and you stop walking. The wheel groans to a halt. You breathe. You sweat. You try not to puke. The block is carefully maneuvered into place by masons and apprentices using crowbars, chisels, and a level, which is basically a water-filled tube nailed to a board. It works. Sort of. When it doesn't, they hit things until they look straight. Precision through percussion. This is what you'll do for the next 6 hours. Up the wheel. Down the wheel. Swap out with another human hamster. Drink tepid water. Repeat. At some point, a monk comes by to observe the majesty of human labor. He offers a prayer. You offer him a silent suggestion to go away forever. The stones being lifted today are part of the tower's base wall, a massively thick foundation layer that supports the entire keep. The bottom of a tower can be 10 to 20 feet thick. Why? Because gravity is a judgmental mistress, and without that thickness, the whole thing collapses like Jeff after a half pint of wine. The design varies depending on geography and era. Square keeps are popular right now. Later, they'll figure out that circular towers are better, fewer blind spots, less collapse. Why? But you're not there yet. You're just trying to build something taller than the forest without getting crushed by it. Once the stones are in place, it's time for courses, horizontal layers of stone that must be level and regular. The master mason is extremely fussy about this. He checks every layer with a plumb bob, which is a fancy name for a string with a rock on the end. If it swings, it's crooked. If it doesn't, you still did it wrong, apparently. You dream of inventing a laser level. You settle for eating a turnip and crying into your jerkin. Now that the base layers are going up, you need scaffolding. You've already helped build some, a chaotic jungle of timber poles, lashings, and wooden planks nailed together by someone who probably used to be a pirate. It sways. It creaks. It breathes. You climb it every day like a squirrel with anxiety. But you have no choice. You haul up more stones, more mortar, more regret. All while the wind whistles through the tower skeleton, and you imagine what your funeral will look like when a support beam finally gives up on life. The walls keep rising. Now the interior is being divided. You help install vaulting arches, because flat ceilings are for peasants. These arches distribute weight evenly and let you build multi-floor towers without squishing the ground floor like a bug. The arches are made of carefully cut stones, called voussoirs, placed in a curve. The center stone at the top? That's the keystone. It's what holds the whole thing together. You whisper a prayer every time you slide one into place. So far, it's worked. Mostly. Above you, carpenters are building a temporary hoist frame, essentially a giant A-frame with a pulley that lets you lift materials even higher, without the wheel. It creaks ominously. You don't trust it, but the carpenter insists it's perfectly safe. He also has 3 fingers, so his credibility is strained. When you finally reach the upper levels, things get weird. You're now installing arrow loops into the tower walls, vertical slits that allow you to rain down violence while enjoying panoramic countryside views. You chisel them out with help from a template, and pray no one test them anytime soon, because your chiseling skills are roughly on par with a drunk goose. You also help install machicolations, overhanging stone balconies with holes in the floor, through which defenders can drop rocks, boiling water, or passive-aggressive letters. These require cantilevered stones, carefully angled to support weight, without crumbling. You've never been more stressed about geometry in your life. At this point, the keep is almost a castle. You can see the whole countryside from the top. Sheep, thatched roofs, smoke, mud, more mud. Jeff passed out in the moat again. Inside the tower, stonemasons are carving out stairs, spirals, usually clockwise going up, so defenders have an advantage using their right hand with a sword. Clever. Unless you're left-handed. Then you're just historically unlucky. There are chambers being plastered. Latrines being added, basically stone chutes that drop waste into a pit or the moat. You now know exactly what the moat smells like. Forever. You're welcome. The roof is next. A conical timber frame covered in lead sheeting or slate tiles, depending on what the Lord can afford. Lead is waterproof. Also toxic. You don't know that yet. You will. Your grandchildren will be born glowing. You install turrets, mini towers on the corners for extra defense and aesthetics. They're adorable. Until you realize you have to haul materials inside them on a ladder with no safety rails. Good luck. As the finishing touch, the Lord adds his banner to the top. A bright, fluttering reminder that this monument to anxiety and physical exhaustion does not belong to you. You build it, but you do not own it. That, in a nutshell, is medieval social structure. The tower is done. It stands like a stone fist against the sky. Silent, ominous, impressively square. You help build something that will last centuries, maybe longer. Tourists will one day walk through this place and marvel at your craftsmanship, completely unaware that you nearly fell off the roof 17 times and have permanent mortar in your nose. You sleep that night in your leaky hut under a sky full of stars and regrets. Your hands are raw. Your knees are swollen. But the tower is up. And, miraculously, it hasn't collapsed. Yet. Jeff is still singing. But you sleep anyway. Because tomorrow, you start on the moat. You wake up to the sound of sloshing water and Jeff arguing with a duck. The duck is winning. Welcome to another glorious morning in medieval castle construction, where you've just finished building an architectural miracle, a stone tower taller than most egos, and instead of being rewarded with a pension, a nap, or even a fresh loaf of bread, you've been reassigned to dig a ditch. A wet, ankle-deep, soul-destroying ditch. Yes, it's time to build the moat. Now, you might think a moat is glamorous. Romantic, even. A dramatic ring of water protecting your fortress from invading armies and nosy peasants. A watery defensive marvel that screams, "You shall not pass." You'd be wrong. A moat, in practice, is a mosquito-infested trench full of despair and diseases you can't pronounce. It's wet. It's cold. It's either bone-dry and impossible to dig, or so muddy you sink in up to your knees and lose a boot. Sometimes both. At once. So before you roll up your sleeves and start flinging buckets of filth, do me a favor, like this video if you're enjoying the historical descent into misery, and subscribe if you want more late-night medieval chaos. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are, and whether you've ever tried to dig a hole with a shovel made of hope and sadness. Right. Onward. To the ditch of doom. Let's begin with why the moat exists. There are 3 reasons. to slow down enemies, to look intimidating, to give castle dwellers something to throw waste into, because the river's too far away. You start by marking out the perimeter of the moat. This is done with string, stakes, and the vague instructions of a man who's never touched a shovel in his life. The shape depends on the castle layout, circular, square, kidney-shaped if the lord was drunk during the planning phase. Then, you dig, and dig, and dig. You dig until your fingernails resemble antique spoons and your shoulders feel like they've personally angered God. The soil is rocky. The clay is stubborn. You chip through roots with a mattock, break your shovel on a boulder, and get yelled at for not being cheerful enough about the trench. The average moat is anywhere from 6 to 30 feet wide and up to 20 feet deep, which, if you're keeping track, is a lot of digging, especially with 13th century tools. No backhoe, no jackhammer, just wood, iron, and the crushing realization that you once had dreams. The soil gets hauled away in baskets by small, unfortunate children. You're not sure where it's going. Possibly into another trench. Possibly to fill in the one Jeff accidentally started in the wrong place. It's hard to say. There's no master plan. Just vague gestures and lots of yelling. Sometimes the moat is dry, just an empty ditch lined with stones or packed clay, intended to trap siege equipment and break ankles. Other times, it's wet, and that's where the real trouble starts. You, unfortunately, are building a wet moat, which means someone has to find a water source, a river, a stream, or divine intervention. In this case, you're close enough to a sluggish, muddy creek that smells like boiled cabbage and disappointment. You spend 3 days trying to divert it using wooden aqueducts, ditches, and the principle of let's dig this way and see what happens. Eventually, water trickles into the moat. It's brown. It's tepid. It contains things that move. You ignore them. You're beyond caring. Now comes lining the moat. Because if you don't, the water will just drain away, leaving you with a damp scar in the earth and a very angry lord. Some moats are lined with clay, a layer of dense, sticky earth pounded into place by barefoot peasants and emotional trauma. Others are lined with stone, which takes longer but lasts longer and looks fancier when the king visits. You're doing clay because your lord is cheap, and because you accidentally dropped a chisel on his favorite goose. You spend days squelching around in the trench, stomping clay with your feet like it's some kind of masochistic winemaking. The smell is indescribable. Something between wet dog and despair. You develop trench foot while still digging the trench. You're not alone. The entire construction crew has been drafted for moat duty. Masons, laborers, even the carpenter who once claimed he was allergic to mud. He's not. He's just bad at being alive. Jeff has been assigned to scare away the frogs, a job he takes far too seriously and may be enjoying. Eventually, the moat begins to hold water. But now you need bridges. Because what's a moat without a way to cross it? You start with a drawbridge, a wooden platform mounted on pivoting arms that can be raised and lowered using ropes, pulleys, and an unhealthy amount of optimism. The carpenters build the base frame from oak because it's strong, resistant to rot, and conveniently available from the forest you've been slowly murdering for timber. The beams are heavy. You help haul them into place using a winch, a lot of shouting, and one guy who swears the bridge will never work because he had a dream about it. You lay down the planks, install the hinge system, and set up the pulley. It's not elegant. The ropes creak. The mechanism groans. You're not entirely sure the whole thing won't collapse the first time someone walks across it with a turkey leg. But it works. For now. Sometimes you don't get a drawbridge. Sometimes it's a causeway, a fixed bridge made of stone or timber that spans the moat. Easier to build. Harder to defend. But if your lord's feeling frugal, it's what you get. You also install murder holes above the entrance just in case someone sneaks across. These let defenders drop rocks, arrows, or other gifts from above. They're named murder holes for a reason. You test one by accidentally dropping your lunch through it. It lands on Jeff. He does not appreciate it. At this point, the moat is technically complete. It's full of water. The bridge works. The ducks are thriving. You are not. But maintenance begins immediately. Because moats are filthy. Without filtration, your lovely defense system quickly becomes a glorified septic tank. Everyone's using it as a garbage chute. Waste from latrines? Moat. Food scraps? Moat. That weird thing that came out of Jeff's foot last week? Also moat. It begins to stink. Badly. Worse than usual. Mosquitoes rise from the surface in clouds thick enough to block out the sun. Frogs croak all night. Rats swim. Something large and unidentified splashes occasionally. You do not investigate. The last time you did, you didn't sleep for 3 days. Sometimes, you have to dredge it. Yes. Dredge. The moat needs to be periodically cleaned. Which means you climb into the waist-deep water with a rake and start fishing out bones, trash, and the occasional helmet from a failed siege. You try not to think about what else is in there. You try not to swallow any water. You fail. One day, a knight riding by on a horse asks how the moat's going. You consider telling him the truth. That you've seen things. That you no longer fear death. That you have become the moat, and the moat has become you. Instead, you smile and say, "Almost done, my lord." He rides away. You go back to your mud. Despite everything, the moat does work. It deterrs attackers. It provides a psychological barrier. And it gives the castle that lovely don't even try it aesthetic. But you'll never swim in it. Ever. The castle is nearing completion. The walls are up. The tower stands proud. The moat glistens like a toxic necklace around your suffering. You, meanwhile, are one sunburn away from becoming part of the landscape. At night, you lie awake on your straw mattress, your back screaming, your boots ruined, and your nose permanently adjusted to the smell of rotting algae and Jeff's onion breath. And just as you close your eyes, someone outside shouts the 2 words that ruin everything. Siege incoming. Because nothing says thankless labor quite like building a castle just in time for someone to try and knock it down. You wake up to the unmistakable smell of burning pig fat, which, in your new normal, can only mean one thing: siege day. Your castle, your beautiful, back-breaking, muddy, lopsided miracle of stone and trauma, is now fully built. The towers gleam in the morning light like the world's angriest wedding cake. The drawbridge creaks majestically. The moat bubbles like a plague-infested cauldron. And the entire place smells faintly of desperation and fermented turnips. You thought this was the finish line. But no. Now, you get to defend the thing. Let's talk about what that means. Because medieval castle defense is less strategic warfare and more long-term camping with increasingly bad food and occasional flaming livestock. It starts, as always, with a guy on a hill. He shows up with a spyglass, some flags, and the general vibe of someone who has very bad news and enjoys delivering it. Then he shouts something like incoming, and everyone inside the castle panics. You, being part of the peasant workforce that never actually left, are now conscripted again, this time not to build, but to bleed. Congratulations. You've been upgraded to defender. It's like getting a promotion at work that comes with more responsibility, worse hours, and also you might get set on fire. Let's walk through the siege process. First, closing the castle. The gates come down. The portcullis slams shut with a rusty groan. The drawbridge rises. The outer bailey, that's the fancy medieval word for yard full of chickens and sadness, is cleared. Any villagers who didn't make it inside in time are now on their own. Some of them try knocking politely. Others try climbing. Jeff tries to disguise himself as a tree. It does not work. You are officially sealed in. And that's when the waiting begins. Siege warfare is 10% fighting and 90% slowly going insane while eating dried beans and listening to the same guy recite Psalm 23 badly for the 100th time. The attacking army sets up camp just out of arrow range. They pitch tents, build latrines, and start sharpening things ominously. Meanwhile, inside the castle, everyone is playing a game called Let's Pretend This Is Fine. Spoiler, it's not. Water is rationed. Food is rationed. Sleep is rationed. Sanity is already gone. The lord of the castle, who up until now has done very little besides wave from balconies and steal credit for your labor, is suddenly extremely involved. He's holding strategy meetings. He's inspecting the walls. He's demanding that the moat smell less peasant-y. You try to suggest boiling oil. He tells you to go sharpen sticks instead. There are, roughly, 3 things you can do in a siege. Hold the walls. Snipe from towers. Wait and hope someone shows up to rescue you. Let's start with holding the walls. This is less brave knight with sword and more, you, hunched behind a parapet with a slingshot and a bucket of rocks. Castle walls are thick, up to 12 feet in some places, made of stone, designed to resist cannonballs before cannonballs even existed. They have crenellations, aka those little up and down bits where you can hide and peek out without instantly dying. You've been assigned to one. It's cold, drafty, and smells like wet limestone and anxiety. From here, you throw things. Rocks, arrows, boiling water if you can spare it. Sometimes sand, which gets in everything and somehow kills people, allegedly. If you're lucky, you get to mun a mangono, a type of medieval catapult that launches objects using twisted ropes and spite. You spend hours flinging things at people you can barely see, while being shot at in return. Arrows whistle past your head. Someone near you takes one to the leg and starts yelling. You patch him up with a rag that might once have been a shirt. He thanks you by immediately vomiting on your shoes. If the attackers get close enough, they might bring siege towers, giant wooden contraptions on wheels, filled with soldiers and regret. These roll slowly toward the walls, and when they arrive, soldiers pour out like the world's worst piñata. You push back with poles, spears, rocks, and, if things are truly desperate, livestock. Yes, there are recorded instances of animals being thrown off towers during sieges. Not for strategic value, just because. Sometimes they use battering rams. These are logs, often capped with metal, designed to bash down gates. You can hear the rhythmic thudding echo through the castle, like the heartbeat of doom. Your job is to pour things through the murder holes: boiling oil, hot sand, pitch, sewage. Yes, you're weaponizing your own bathroom now. And speaking of sewage, let's talk about undermining. Attackers sometimes dig tunnels under the walls, trying to collapse them by weakening the foundations. This is called sapping, and it's as miserable as it sounds. Defenders, in turn, dig countermines to find and kill the sappers. It becomes a kind of underground horror maze, with rats and no maps. You've never prayed so hard for a wall to hold in your life. But eventually, someone does break through. If the gate is breached, or if a section of wall collapses, then it's hand-to-hand combat. The enemy charges in. You are given a helmet and a vague pat on the back. Your weapon is either a sword, an axe, a stick with nails, or whatever you can find that resembles a thing that hurts. The fighting is brutal. There is no choreography, no epic one-on-one duels. Just mud, blood, screams, and the occasional person yelling, "Where's Jeff?" because he has, once again, vanished. If you lose, the castle is sacked. This is a fun medieval term that means looted, burned, and generally ruined beyond recognition. The attackers take everything: food, weapons, furniture, tapestries, chickens, the weird skull collection your lord kept in his study. If they're feeling generous, they might spare your life. If not, well, you had a good run. Sometimes they burn the place to the ground. Sometimes they move in and turn it into their own fortress, which is a bit like losing your house and then watching the new tenants repainted in colors you hate. But let's say you win a siege. Huzzah! The attackers retreat. The gates open. The banners wave. You're still not happy, because now you have to rebuild. The towers are damaged. The walls are scorched. Half the moat is filled with bodies and someone's goat. The Lord declares a feast, but all you get is cabbage stew and a smile that says, "I take credit for your suffering." And then someone mentions another castle, one just a few miles west. They're thinking of building there next summer. You quietly pack your things, because you know the truth: castle construction never ends. It just relocates. Now, for a fun fact, medieval castles didn't just defend against armies. They defended against rebellions. Yes, your lord was often more afraid of his own people than foreign invaders. So the castle was less a cozy home and more a stone insurance policy against peasant uprisings. The great irony? Most castles were never actually attacked. Some were sieged. A few were conquered. But many just sat there, watching, waiting, occasionally used for administrative meetings and wine tastings. But every one of them could be attacked. And that was the point. The castle was a message, a stone middle finger to anyone thinking about stirring the pot. It said, "We have walls. We have archers. We have a moat full of regret and frogs. And you build it with your hands. And now you're stuck inside it, waiting for the next disaster, with trench foot, a crust of dried gravy in your hair, and Jeff somehow stealing your rations again. You lie awake in your chamber, which is just a drafty corridor next to the latrines, and listen to the wind howl through the arrow slits. Somewhere far below, a guard walks the battlements, whistling off-key. You curl into your straw mattress, close your eyes, and try not to dream about digging. Because tomorrow, someone will discover the well is contaminated. And guess who's on bucket duty? You wake up freezing. Not just chilly. Not need another blanket, cold. No, you wake up with your teeth doing tap dancing routines, and your breath forming little ghost clouds above your face. Because you, lucky you, now live in a castle. And as it turns out, castles, glorious, towering symbols of feudal dominance, are actually giant stone refrigerators. There is no insulation. There is no central heating. There is no cozy fire flickering in the corner of your room. Because your room isn't a room. It's a glorified broom closet in the North Tower, which you now share with a scribe, a soldier, a monk who hums Gregorian chants in his sleep, and something that might be a bat. The walls are damp. The floor is damp. Your blankets are damp. Your soul is damp. Welcome home. Now, before we get into your fabulous new daily routine, take a moment to do the thing. Like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to me gently roasting medieval infrastructure. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm always mildly horrified to learn how many of you are watching this at 4 a.m. while eating cereal from a mug. Back to your new life. Your day starts before sunrise, naturally, because the rooster has absolutely no chill, and neither do the servants running through the halls yelling about bread deliveries and chamber pots. You groggily pull on your one tunic, stiff from last week's rain and questionable laundering, and head down 5 flights of uneven stone steps, which are mostly designed to make invaders trip and fall, but are now just your commute. At the bottom, you reach the Great Hall, which sounds majestic and kingly, but is really just a large open room full of noise, dogs, smoke, and the distinct smell of wet wool and centuries of mild disappointment. Here's the truth: castle life is chaos. There are about 40 people living in this place, and that's just the permanent staff. You've got cooks, servants, guards, falconers, pages, scribes, a knight who smells like he's fermenting from the inside, and the lord's second cousin who's been just visiting for 3 years. Add livestock, 4 bored children, and a lute player who refuses to stop singing about barley, and you have the medieval equivalent of a frat house built inside a prison. Let's talk about meals. Breakfast is sad. You're handed a chunk of yesterday's bread, maybe dipped in broth if someone's feeling generous. There's a communal bucket of pottage, which is essentially hot mystery mush. It's brown, it jiggles, and it's technically edible. If you're really lucky, you get a bit of cheese. Not the good kind. The kind that squeaks against your teeth and smells like someone buried it as a prank. There's no coffee, no tea, just water from the well, and possibly ale, because it's safer than water and you're already too tired to question that logic. After breakfast, it's chore time. You think castle life means lounging around being majestic? Wrong. You are working. If you're not important enough to sit at the high table, and spoiler, you're not, then you're important enough to scrub floors, haul firewood, feed hawks, fix the drawbridge, mop up after the lord's and Conan hunting dog, or chase pigeons out of the chapel again. And if the lord has guests, oh boy. That means entertainment, which for you means fetching, carrying, lighting torches, preparing feasts, and occasionally pretending to laugh at his cousin's jokes, which are mostly about turnips and a priest's daughter. The feast, by the way, is the one time the castle almost feels warm. Dozens of candles flickering, fires roaring, food laid out in ostentatious piles, roasted meats, jellied fish, fruit sculpted into mildly erotic shapes. You don't get to eat it, of course. You get to serve it. You stand quietly, holding a pitcher of wine, while the nobles debate Latin grammar and which French guy they hate this week. When they're done, they throw the scraps onto the floor for the dogs. You get whatever's left after the dogs. Sometimes the dogs are faster than you. Let's pause for a second and talk about bathing. Because castle life, and I cannot stress this enough, is filthy. There is no plumbing. There are no showers. There is a single large wooden tub that gets dragged into the hall once a week. Water is heated in cauldrons. The lord bathes first, then the lady, then the children, then the priest, then the dogs, probably. By the time it's your turn, the water looks like soup. You sit in it anyway, because that's your only chance until next month. To dry off, you use a rough wool cloth that feels like it's exfoliating you down to your memories. Then you get back in your itchy tunic and pretend hygiene is a state of mind. Toilets? Let's not be cute. You're using a garderobe, which is a fancy word for a hole in the wall that drops into the moat. It's cold, it's windy, and you pray every time you go that you won't drop your only belt in there again. Sometimes, in summer, the smell wafts back up. You've never known such betrayal. Now, let's talk nighttime. After a long day of carrying, fetching, avoiding rats the size of small pigs, and listening to your lord shout, "Do you know who I am?" at passing messengers, you retire to your sleeping quarters, which, as we established, is somewhere between a storage closet and a chimney. You sleep on a straw mattress. The straw has fleas. The fleas have names. Your blanket is wool. Your pillow is a burlap sack filled with regret. Your roommate hums. The bat is still here. You don't know its name, but it's been watching you, judging you. There is no such thing as silence. The wind howls through the corridors. The walls groan. The guards stomp. Somewhere down the hall, someone is throwing up into a boot. You stare at the ceiling and wonder if Jeff made it to that castle in the west. Now, despite all this, and I mean all of this, you occasionally get a moment of peace. Maybe it's watching the sun rise over the battlements, or feeding the falcons and watching them launch into the sky with cold efficiency. Maybe it's sitting by the fire after the feast and hearing the minstrels sing about ancient battles you're glad you didn't fight in. Or maybe it's just realizing you're still alive. Because in medieval terms, that's a luxury. And sure, your socks are damp, your bed smells like goat, and you started seeing rats as potential roommates instead of enemies, but you're not at war. Not this week. Not yet. And so, you drift asleep with your head against your scratchy sack pillow, the scent of boiled cabbage still lingering in the air, and the distant sound of someone yelling, "Where's my sword?" even though it's clearly being used to cut cheese. This is castle life. Glorious. Grim. And somehow, still better than living outside. You wake up in a feather bed. Not straw. Not hay. Actual feathers. And linens. Imported ones. The kind that scream, "I exploit at least 3 countries in a trade route just to sleep comfortably." Because congratulations, today you're the lord of this fine stone box of drafty power and confused peasants. You live in a castle. You own the land. You wear fur-lined cloaks and have an underwhelming beard that everyone pretends is magnificent. But here's the twist, your life is still miserable. Just expensive miserable. Sure, you don't dig ditches anymore. You don't scrub floors or fight rats for the last piece of cheese. You've leveled up from mud-stained serf to regional warlord. But your daily life? Still chaotic, still cold, and still entirely without peace and quiet. You awaken to the sound of bells. Not for beauty. For schedule. The morning bell means it's time for prayer, which, as a nobleman, you absolutely must pretend to care about. So you haul yourself out of bed, pull on a tunic made of wool thick enough to stop an arrow, but somehow not the cold, and shuffle down the corridor to your private chapel. And by private, we mean a glorified closet with stained glass that leaks when it rains and a priest who may or may not be stealing your wine. You mutter your way through morning devotions while mentally reviewing your to-do list, which includes yelling at your steward for last week's tax returns, inspecting the new battlements, holding court with peasants who think you care, and pretending you understand your own Latin correspondence. Oh, and later, you have a feast. Not for fun. Because politics. Let's talk about that. Being a medieval lord is 90% pretending. You pretend to be wise. You pretend to be generous. You pretend to know what that French envoy meant when he insulted your table linen at last week's banquet. But mostly, you pretend you have control over your own house. You don't. Your wife, the lady of the castle, runs everything. The servants report to her. The meals are approved by her. The linen inventory? All her. You once tried to reorder the meat cellar, and she still hasn't spoken to you properly since. She runs this place with an iron will and a shoe collection that could destabilize a monarchy. So what do? Mostly, you wander. You tour your castle like a confused middle manager doing a surprise inspection. You stop in the Great Hall and nod approvingly at a tapestry you've never really understood. You peer into the kitchens and mutter something about efficiency while the cooks pretend not to hate you. Then, of course, comes the court session. This is when local peasants come into your hall to complain about everything from missing pigs to witchcraft to Jeff. Yes, he's still alive somehow. You sit in your high-back chair, which is mostly ceremonial and deeply uncomfortable, and try not to yawn as old Tom accuses new Tom of goat theft for the third time this month. You render justice, mostly based on your mood and how much wine you had with breakfast. If you're feeling misciful, someone gets fined. If not, well, off to the stocks. Or worse, the dungeon, which is just a wet hole in the basement that smells like betrayal and mushrooms. Then you have a meeting with your steward, who insists on reading everything out loud and in full, despite the fact that you still don't understand medieval accounting. He talks about tithes, rents, grain shortages, pig losses, and something called bridge maintenance, which you didn't even know you owned. At one point, you consider faking your own death just to avoid signing more parchment. Lunchtime? A little better. You eat upstairs in your solar, which sounds bright and fancy but is really just the room with a fireplace and slightly fewer rats. You get hot meat, fresh bread, and occasionally something green, though nobody's entirely sure what it is. You sip watered wine and listen to a bard sing a story about your grandfather that's definitely made up. In the afternoon, you go hunting. Not because you need the meat, because it's expected. You put on too much fur, ride a horse that hates you, and disappear into the woods with 5 knights, 7 dogs, and a falcon named Regret. The hunt is long, muddy, and mostly involves yelling at squires. You chase a deer for 4 hours and eventually let the dogs handle it. Back at the castle, you parade in like you personally defeated nature. The servants pretend to be impressed. Your wife rolls her eyes. The deer is taken to the kitchens. You still smell like leaves. Then comes dinner. And here's where your life looks almost good. Because a castle feast, even a casual one, is elaborate. Tables are loaded with roasted swan, honeyed fruits, weird jelly constructions, pies that may or may not contain an entire goose, and trenchers made of stale bread. There's harp music, minstrels, dancing, gossip, and someone inevitably trying to impress your wife with a poem about her elbows. You drink. A lot. Not because you're celebrating. Because you're avoiding tomorrow. You smile. You nod. You toast. You laugh at the same joke your cousin has told for 7 years. You make polite war threats. You accept gifts you'll never use. You forget which noble family you're allied with this month. Then you stagger up to your room, step over your dog, and collapse into bed, where you lie awake listening to the wind moan through the stonework and think, this place is going to burn down someday. Because here's the dirty secret of castle ownership. You're always one mistake from ruin. One bad harvest. One insult to the wrong noble. One outbreak of plague. One really determined group of peasants with pitchforks and a dream. You rule because you have walls, wealth, and a sword. But those are fragile things. And deep down, you know it. Now let's take a moment to appreciate the castle's design from the Lord's perspective. It's not just about security. It's about status. Everything in this place screams hierarchy. You sleep above your subjects, literally, in the highest tower. You eat at the raised dais. You sit in the big chair. Your chapel faces east. Your walls are decorated with your ancestors, all looking vaguely disappointed in you. Your clothes are custom. Your boots are clean. You bathe monthly, which, in medieval terms, makes you a goddess of hygiene. And every servant who brushes past you bows just slightly too low, because they don't know if today is the day you have a mood swing and accuse someone of sorcery. Still, even with all the power, you have no privacy. Every room echoes. Every conversation carries. Servants are always around. Guards follow you everywhere. Your scribe reads your letters before you do. You once tried to cry in a solar and 3 people asked if you needed more firewood. And worst of all, you have meetings. With clergy. With land agents. With distant relatives who want money. With knights who want to go on a crusade. With builders who say the north wall is probably fine but also might collapse. You fantasize about becoming a peasant just for the peace and quiet. But instead, you wake up the next morning, to the bells, to the frost, to the smell of damp stone, and you do it all over again. Because this is castle life at the top. And it's not a dream. It's just a very expensive, very cold, very well-defended trap. You wake up in mud. Not a bit of dampness. Not, oh no, it rained last night. No, you wake up in mud. You sleep on a floor made of compacted earth, which has now returned to its natural, squishy, soul-devouring state because the thatched roof above your head has a hole in it the size of an ecclesiastical debate. Welcome to life in the medieval village. You're not a knight. You're not a noble. You're not even a merchant. You are, officially, one of the 98% of humanity who never gets remembered in history books. You are a peasant, a serf, a tiller of soil, a lifelong mud connoisseur. Your name is probably something like Will or Ida or Joan, simple, sturdy, forgettable. You live with 3 children, 2 pigs, a goat with behavioral issues, and your cousin Henry, who may or may not be hiding from tax collection. Your home is a wattle and daub cottage, which sounds quaint until you realize it translates to sticks, mud, and the audacity to call this shelter. There are no windows, just holes. There is no chimney, just a central fire pit that turns your home into a smoky lung trap. Your bed is straw. Your blanket is also straw. And your pillow is a bundle of straw you shaped with your forehead over time. Congratulations. You're awake. It's somewhere between dawn and still technically night, but that doesn't matter. The rooster is already screaming, and you've got a full day of labor ahead of you. But before we get to the suffering, take a second, like the video and subscribe if you enjoy this gentle plunge into historical discomfort. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether it's raining, because honestly, I need to know if anyone is dry right now. Right. On to the grinding misery. Your day starts with breakfast, a term that here means a bowl of warm barley porridge and the realization that you're never going to taste cinnamon. You eat with your hands. There are no utensils. There are no plates. Everything is shared. You sit on a stool made from a stump. The stool wobbles. You don't have time to care. Then it's outside to the fields. You work land that isn't yours. It belongs to the Lord in the big stone castle on the hill, the one who waves politely once a year during taxes, then rides off to yell at someone else about grain storage. Your job? Grow crops. Maintain livestock. Dig ditches. Repair fences. Try not to die. The main crop is barley, which you grow, dry, crush, boil, and then eat until it becomes part of your personality. Sometimes it's bread. Sometimes it's porridge. Sometimes it's barley wine, which is less wine and more fermented sadness with a kick. The fields are vast and rocky. You have no plow. You have no ox. You have Henry, and Henry has opinions about soil that are always wrong. The work is backbreaking, and the tools are laughably primitive. A wooden hoe. A rusted sickle. A shovel you made from another, more broken shovel. Your hands are permanently dirty. Your back aches in ways you didn't know possible. Your knees click like castanets when you bend. Midday comes. It's time for lunch, which is bread. Again, hard bread, baked 3 days ago. You dunk it in ale, because your teeth can't handle dry food anymore. You chew for 6 minutes. You lose focus halfway through. You haven't had a vegetable since Easter. You share with the goat, who judges you. Afternoons are for repair work. You patch the fence. You fix the roof. You chase the pig out of the grain bin again. You repair the chicken coop. You help your neighbor dig a new well, and don't ask why the last one mysteriously collapsed. You hear rumors about bandits in the forest, about a holy relic being stolen from the abbey, about someone in the next village getting a new tunic and immediately catching a plague. You tuck those stories into the mental folder labeled things that will eventually involve me. The sun begins to dip. You return home. Your entire body is buzzing with fatigue, and not in the sexy, post-gym way, more like I fell down a well full of hammers. Dinner is more barley, with maybe an onion. You gather around the hearth. There's smoke. There's coughing. Your children ask if they'll ever see the sea. You say maybe, and silently think, definitely not. After dinner, there's storytelling. Your neighbor tells tales of dragons and saints. Someone plays a crude fiddle. You pretend to listen while mentally calculating how much firewood you'll need to survive winter. Henry mentions starting a pig breeding business again. Everyone ignores him. Let's talk about illness. Because you're definitely going to get sick. Maybe it's dysentery. Maybe it's scurvy. Maybe it's just the fever, which is a catch-all term for we have no idea what this is, but it's going to be dramatic. There is no doctor. The healer is a widow who collects moss and hums threateningly. The cure for most things is prayer, bloodletting, or bee stings. If you sneeze twice in one day, someone starts preparing your grave. You go to bed early. Not because you want to. Because there's no light. Candles are expensive. Oil lamps smell weird. Your eyes hurt from the smoke. You curl up on your straw pile and try to find a comfortable position among the lumps, sticks, and goat droppings. You fall asleep to the sounds of crickets, snoring, and your neighbor's loud existential crisis about barley yields. Occasionally, you dream of something better. Maybe owning a cow. Maybe a week without rain. Maybe shoes that don't leak. But deep down, you know this is it. This is life in the medieval village. You will live here. You will die here. And your name will be carved onto a wooden marker that lasts about 3 winters before becoming firewood. Let's talk community for a second. Because for all its suffering, village life is deeply communal. You share everything: tools, gossip, child-rearing, diseases. You help each other. You feed each other. You mourn together. You marry across family lines like it's a hobby. You dance at festivals with muddy feet and questionable rhythm. You may not have luxury, or privacy, or actual furniture, but you're not alone. Your neighbors would carry you through fire. Sometimes literally, when the houses catch. And catch they do. Because your entire village is made of flammable dreams. One wrong spark, one candle drop during a full moon ritual, and suddenly half the town is lighting up the sky like a religious omen. You grab a bucket. You yell. You form a line. You fight the blaze with desperation and spit. You rebuild. The next morning, someone suggests replacing the thatch with tile. Everyone laughs. What are you? Made of money. You patch the roof with more hay and continue your life. So why don't you leave? Because you can't. You're tied to this land by feudal law. You owe your labor to the Lord. You pay taxes in grain, eggs, and the occasional chicken. You attend church every Sunday not just to pray, but because it's your only social outlet that isn't arguing about cows. If you leave, you're a vagabond, a criminal. If you stay, you're a subject, a respected cog in the wheel of rural monotony. The difference is paperwork. Every year, you have festivals. Religious ones. Pagan ones. Some that no one even remembers the origin of. You dress up in your finest, your only, tunic, drink until you forget about winter, and hope the fertility rites work this time. You dance with strangers. You swap stories. You pray no one gets trampled. Winter comes. You huddle together. You burn whatever isn't essential. You eat stored grains, dried fish, and regret. Sickness spreads. People die. Babies are born in secret. You dig graves in frozen ground. Spring returns. You plant. You live. You suffer. You dance. And you tell stories about the old days, the time before the fire, the year the harvest was good, the summer you saw a nobleman ride through town and thought, for just a moment, about what it would be like to live up there in the castle. But only for a moment. Because let's be honest, they probably have to eat barley too. You wake up stuck to your mattress. No, not in the slept weird, now your arms numb kind of way. You are literally adhered to your bedding by a thin film of sweat, filth, and centuries of questionable choices. Your mattress is stuffed with straw, old clothes, and what you're 85% sure was once a dead mouse. It smells like betrayal and onions. Congratulations, you're alive in medieval Europe, and your hygiene routine is less spa day and more biological warfare. Your breath smells like barley porridge and medieval dentistry. Your teeth, what's left of them, are coated in a solid film of plaque and despair. You haven't bathed in weeks, but honestly, you stopped noticing after the third layer of grime fused with your skin and started a small civilization of its own. Welcome to the scented nightmare that is personal care before modern plumbing. But before we wade chest deep into a barrel of lye soap and regret, go ahead and like this video, and subscribe if this soothing march through historical discomfort is your jam. Drop a comment too. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you're blessed with indoor plumbing, so I can vicariously live through your clean, bacteria-free existence. Now, back to the odor. Here's the thing, most people in the Middle Ages weren't filthy because they enjoyed being crusty little stink gremlins. They were filthy because staying clean was extremely difficult, wildly impractical, and occasionally fatal. First, let's address the bathing situation. Baths were, in theory, a thing. In fact, public bathhouses were relatively common in larger towns, for men, women, and anyone who could afford a few pennies and a mild risk of syphilis. They were sort of like Roman baths, except with more splinters, less marble, and an atmosphere that screamed, "This water is recycled." You paid to sit in a big, wooden tub filled with warm water, maybe some herbs, maybe some oils, if you were lucky, and stew in the filth of your neighbors. It was less of a personal hygiene thing and more of a community broth. Bathing at home was a different story. If you lived in a castle, sure, you could summon some poor servant to fill a wooden tub with buckets of water hauled up from the well, heated over a fire, poured one agonizing splash at a time. By the time it was ready, the water was lukewarm at best and you were already rethinking your life choices. If you lived in a village, you bathed in the river, assuming it wasn't frozen, or contaminated, or currently being used to wash laundry, dye wool, dump chamber pots, or drown unwanted sins. The idea of regular bathing, like daily or even weekly, was met with suspicion. Many believed too much exposure to water opened your pores, which led in disease, demons, or bad vibes, depending on which monk you asked. So instead of bathing, people leaned heavily on dry cleaning. No, not the fancy kind with hangers and receipts, the medieval kind involving scraping your skin with a knife to remove dirt, rubbing down with cloths, or powdering yourself with flour, ashes, or ground-up herbs until you resembled a slightly seasoned chicken. Let's talk soap. There was soap, just not the nice, lemon-scented kind. Most medieval soap was made from animal fat, tallow, and lye boiled together in a cauldron of hopes and eye-burning despair. It smelled vaguely like scorched bacon and existential dread. It got you cleaner, but only if you survived the chemical burns. Also, it was expensive. If you were poor, you either made your own, with zero safety precautions, or you just didn't use any and hoped the rain would sort you out eventually. Now let's move on to hair. Hair care was, how do I put this, theater of the absurd. Shampoo didn't exist. Conditioner? Only if you count goose grease or blessed oils handed out by monks with suspiciously shiny scalps. People washed their hair rarely, and when they did, it was with water, sometimes with herbs or vinegar. If you had lice, and you probably did, you dealt with it using combs, ashes, or the time-honored method of scratching yourself furiously while pretending you're just thinking. If you were rich, you might have your hair braided or tied up under elaborate headwear. If you were poor, it was whatever your fingers could manage. Dreadlocks? Common. Not on purpose. Just a side effect of time, sweat, and not having Pantene. Teeth? No toothbrush. No floss. No fluoride. No fun. Medieval people sometimes chewed on sticks, used linen cloths to scrub, or rinsed with wine, vinegar, or urine. Yes, urine. Because ammonia. Toothaches were common. Cures included drilling, herbal poultices, or yanking the tooth out with pliers while biting a stick and screaming internally. If your jaw swelled, you were either about to die or become a local legend. Let's talk about toilets. Or rather, the lack thereof. If you lived in a castle, you might have a garderobe, essentially a stone chute built into the wall that deposited your offerings into the moat, a pit, or the unfortunate bushes below. It was cold, drafty, and scented like Satan's compost bin. If you lived in a town, you used a cesspit, basically a large, unlined hole that slowly filled with sewage until someone got paid to dig it out. Spoiler, that job paid badly. And if you lived in a village, it was the bucket method. You did your business in a wooden pail or chamber pot, then flung it into the street or a designated dung heap, depending on how optimistic you were about public health. Sometimes you'd hear someone yell Gardolo before launching their waste out a window. This was your cue to run for your life or get baptized in someone else's digestive failures. The streets? Rivers of slush, mud, manure, and worse. In summer, they smelled like boiled frogs. In winter, they froze into a tragicomic obstacle course. Footwear was minimal. You walked through this in sandals if you were lucky. Otherwise, you just embraced the texture. Let's pivot for a moment. What did you smell like? You, And everyone else smelled like sweat, damp wool, tallow, garlic, animal, old wood smoke, mildew, unwashed linen, and whatever you had for lunch 2 days ago. Your nose adjusted. Your guess didn't. Perfume existed, sure, but mostly among the wealthy. It was used to mask, not fix, the problem. A noblewoman might dab her wrists with rose water. A peasant might rub mint under their arms and call it a miracle. Then there's laundry. It existed. It was exhausting. You boiled your clothes in a cauldron, beat them with paddles, rinsed them in a river, then dried them over hedges or bushes. This was done maybe once a month. Maybe. Because linen is expensive, soap is rare, and time is a luxury. So yes, medieval people changed their clothes rarely and washed them even less. Undergarments, like linen shifts or braids, absorbed most of the sweat. You washed those. Eventually. But outer garments? You wore them into the afterlife. Let's not forget body hair. It was there. Unless you were a monk or nun with a vow of piety and a regular shaving ritual, you left it alone. Armpits, legs, faces, hair was natural, useful, and warm. Razors existed, but so did tetanus. For women, hair was hidden under veils, coifs, or wimples. Not for fashion, but because modesty and head lice go together like ale and disappointment. Now, for our favorite medieval invention, the plague doctor. Their terrifying beak masks weren't just for the goth aesthetic. They were filled with herbs, vinegar-soaked cloth, and crushed flowers, anything to drown out the stench of the dying, who weren't exactly booking spa appointments. People believed disease spread through miasma, bad air. They weren't wrong, entirely, just dramatically unequipped to deal with it. So hygiene, in their view, was more about avoiding smells than removing bacteria. To cleanse your soul, sure, take a bath. To cleanse your body, try not to sweat. Try not to breathe in corpses. Maybe burn some incense. Good luck. Let's finish with the ritual of cleanliness, not physical, but spiritual. Washing your hands before meals was common, but only because they were your utensils. You dip them in a shared basin or get splashed by a servant with a jug. Soap optional. At church, washing was symbolic, a purification. You could be filthy and lice-ridden, but if your soul was scrubbed clean by confession, then God was cool with your scent. And maybe that's the strangest part. They didn't think of themselves as dirty. They thought of themselves as normal. You, sitting there in your 21st century apartment with your bath bomb, deodorant, and 10-step skincare routine, are an alien to them. Unreachable. Unimaginable. They would probably assume you were royalty. Or possessed. But they weren't stupid. They worked with what they had. They used herbs, oils, ashes. They adapted. They survived. So next time your hot water runs cold for 3 minutes or your favorite shampoo gets discontinued, remember, it could be worse. You could be scrubbing yourself with sand and praying your lice die before your cousin finds them. You wake up with a sense of dread. Not just the regular medieval dread, the one that comes from eating suspicious meat or hearing your neighbor cough, but the special kind that arrives when you remember you're due in court today. You didn't kill anyone. Probably. But you did borrow a chicken without asking. And someone noticed. And now you're at the mercy of medieval justice, which is roughly a blend of divine roulette, public theater, and punishment-based improv. You have no lawyer. There is no court stenographer. The judge might be a noble, a priest, or your neighbor's cousin, depending on how big your village is and how drunk everyone is. Welcome to the most backward, confusing, and sometimes hilarious legal system in history. But first, yes, you guessed it, take a second to like this video and subscribe if your idea of comfort is listening to graphic descriptions of 12th century punishment while trying to fall asleep. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from, what time it is, and whether your local court system relies on trial by boiling water. Because I'm willing to bet, it doesn't. Okay, let's talk medieval justice. Or, as we like to call it, crime and unreasonably cruel punishment. The first thing to understand is that there wasn't one unified legal system. No central police force. No Supreme Court. No law books with shiny leather covers. Justice in the Middle Ages was like everything else, chaotic, decentralized, and extremely creative. Depending on when and where you were, you might be subject to royal law, manorial law, church law, feudal law, or whatever the baron feels like today law. and sometimes all of those at once. Let's start small. You're a peasant in a rural village. You've been accused of stealing your neighbor's goat. You didn't. The goat came to you, obviously. In this case, you'll likely be hauled before the manorial court, the lowest court in the feudal hierarchy. The Lord Steward runs the court. He sits on a wooden bench, frowning like his lunch didn't sit right. Around him are a bunch of villagers, serving as the jury, not because they're legal experts, but because they were free on Tuesday. The charges are read out loud, probably by someone who can barely read. You're told to prove your innocence. And now you have two options. Option 1, oath-taking. You swear you didn't steal the goat. Then you get a bunch of your friends, called oath helpers, to swear the same thing. They don't have to be witnesses. They don't need evidence. They just need to look honest and not smell like perjury. This system is known as compurgation, and it's as reliable as a wet torch in a thunderstorm. If your friends are convincing, or if you bribe them with turnips and promises, you're declared innocent. Justice served. The goat is forgotten. But if you don't have enough oath helpers, then we move to option 2. Trial by ordeal. Ah yes, the medieval favorite. Because when humans are confused about how to find truth, they dunk people in rivers and wait to see who floats. Let's review the greatest hits. Ordeal by hot iron. You're forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several steps. Then your hand is bandaged. If it heals cleanly in 3 days, you're innocent. If it festers, you're guilty. Either way, you now have third-degree burns. Ordeal by water. You're tied up and thrown into a body of water. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty and probably a witch. Fun twist, many accuse people were weighted improperly and drowned anyway. But hey, at least they were cleared of wrongdoing post-mortem. Ordeal by fire, similar to the hot iron, but sometimes you had to walk over coals or stick your hand into a flame. Because apparently God doubles as a pyromaniac. Ordeal by ingestion. Yes, this is real. You might be forced to swallow a hunk of blessed bread and cheese, and if you choked, that meant you were lying. Congratulations, you were judged by dairy. The belief was that God would protect the innocent. He'd intervene in your burns, buoyancy, or digestion, which worked great unless God was taking a nap that day. Church courts preferred the ordeal system up until 1215, when Pope Innocent III decided maybe setting people on fire wasn't very Christian. So trials by ordeal were phased out. Slowly. Very slowly. In some villages, they stuck around for another 100 years or so because no one told the local priest. Now, let's say you're not just a goat borrower, you're a murderer. You've killed someone during a tavern brawl over who gets the last hunk of bread. Oops. You're dragged to the royal court, or if you're lucky, you claim something called benefit of clergy. Benefit of clergy was a delightful little loophole that let you escape secular punishment by pretending to be a priest. All you had to do was read a passage from the Bible, known as the neck verse. If you could read Latin, you were deemed a man of the cloth, even if you were just a baker with good memorization skills. It was a brilliant system. Illiterate criminals would memorize the neck verse, pretend to read it, and be spared execution, often with just a branding mark on their thumb to say, "This guy already got one free pass." Now, if you couldn't read and you didn't have friends to swear for you, and the ordeal left you crispy and guilty, then it was punishment time. And wow, medieval punishments were like Renaissance fairs hosted by sadists. For theft, you might be fined, whipped, or have your ear cut off. If you were a repeat offender, you could lose a hand, or both, or your life. For murder, hanging was common. Very public, very slow. For treason, it got theatrical. Men were hanged, drawn, and quartered, meaning they were dragged to the execution site, hanged until mostly dead, cut open, their entrails pulled out and burned, then chopped into 4 pieces and sent to various corners of the kingdom as a friendly reminder to behave. Women were usually spared the full horror, not out of mercy, but modesty. They were burned at the stake instead. Because, dignity. Then there's the pillory. You've seen it in movies, a wooden board with holes for your head and hands. You're locked in it for hours or days while people throw rotten vegetables, mud, or creative insults. It was equal parts punishment and community entertainment. If you were a baker who sold underweight bread, pillory. If you lied about your taxes, pillory. If you sang off-key in church, Well, maybe not pillory, but definitely some side-eye. Let's not forget scolds, women accused of gossiping or nagging. Yes, that was a crime. They might be fitted with a scold's bridle, a metal cage for the head with a bit that went in the mouth. You couldn't speak. You couldn't eat. You just stood there while people judged you for caring too much about your neighbor's marital drama. And if your crime was truly weird, like animal bestiality, corpse theft, or sorcery, the punishment could get creative. Like being buried alive, sewn into a sack with a rooster and thrown into a river, or dragged behind a cart through town. All of this was done publicly, loudly, spectacularly. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about theater. The message was clear: sin, and you will suffer. Disobey, and you'll become the village's weekly entertainment special. Now, if you were wealthy, things were different. Rich people could pay fines instead of facing mutilation. They could hire scribes to forge documents, bribe officials, or flee to another estate entirely. Justice was, shockingly, not blind. It wore a monocle and tilted toward whoever could afford the best ale for the sheriff. Let's take a detour into church law, also called canon law. If you committed a religious offense, like heresy, blasphemy, or criticizing the Pope's hat, you'd be hauled before an ecclesiastical court. These trials were quieter, less theatrical, but still terrifying. You might be imprisoned in a monastery, forced to fast for weeks, flogged, or excommunicated, which was like being unfriended by God and everyone else. If you were a full-on heretic, burned, at the stake, in public, with singing. But what if you didn't wait to be arrested? What if, upon realizing you'd committed a crime, you ran to a church and claimed sanctuary? Believe it or not, this worked. Churches were considered holy ground. If you made it inside and touched the altar, you couldn't be dragged out, at least not for 40 days. You could stay there, surviving on alms, while the townspeople glared at you from the pews. Eventually, you'd have to choose: stand trial, or agree to abjure the realm, leave the country forever, walking barefoot to the coast with a cross around your neck and zero packing list. It was justice by exile. Poetic, lonely, cold. And finally, we come to the absurd. Medieval courts loved a good drama, and sometimes that included animals. Yes, animals. On trial. Pigs, dogs, even insects were occasionally brought to court and formally tried for crimes like murder, trespass, or damaging crops. They were assigned lawyers. They had witnesses. And if found guilty, they were executed. Because if a sow kills a child, obviously the next step is to hang the pig. Clearly, this wasn't satire. This happened. Multiple times. With full documentation. Why? Because medieval people were many things: unwashed, fearful, oddly fond of burning. But they weren't stupid. They believed the world was infused with meaning. That justice mattered. Even if it meant condemning a rooster for laying an egg. So as you fall asleep tonight, be thankful for things like public defenders, evidence-based trials, and the absence of judicial cheese. Because in the 1300s, guilt was determined by fire, pigs were suspects, and if you couldn't float, you were innocent and also dead.